How many of you know both Abraham and Lot were righteous? Amen. Right? Lot sat in the gate of Sodom, which means he had authority, right? But here's the difference. Remember, it says, as in the days of Noah, and it is in the days of Lot. That's what the times are going to be like. Well, guess what? In Noah's day, he knew what was coming and when. In Lot's day, Abraham knew what was coming and when. They understood the calendar. But guess what? Abraham is on the mountain praying and interceding for what's about to happen. Lot represents the church that's assimilated and totally clueless with what's about to happen. Do you know what Lot's name means in Hebrew? There are 3 Hebrew letters. In Hebrew, every letter is a word, every letter is a picture, every letter is a number. But the first letter is the L, or the Lamed, and in Hebrew, the Lamed was a shepherd's staff representing authority. The next letter is the Vav, which was a nail, and in Hebrew, the Vav is a conjunction. It's the word and. It connects 2 things. The last letter of Lot's name is the Tet, which is the serpent. So Lot represents the church that gives the authority over to the serpent. That's what Lot's very name means. They don't get involved, and they get assimilated, and they have no idea. Okay, tomorrow you're going to experience something that is going to be phenomenal. You're going to be up on Mars Hill, the Acropolis, where Paul was debating with all the philosophers. All right? Athens is known for what? Philosophy. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what was just mentioned, replacement theology, a little bit, and how it's affected the church. And a lot of people think, well, I don't believe in replacement theology. I mean, yes, you do. You just don't realize it. And when I begin to point it out, it's like, oh, shock and awe. All right. Here's part of the problem is every Christian denomination in every country has a different picture of Jesus. That's why you have Hispanic Jesus, Chinese Jesus, African American Jesus, American Jesus. And you look at the mother and child, you have a Chinese mother and child, an Hispanic mother and child. He won't even recognize his own baby pictures. Now, do you remember that when Joseph's brothers came to Egypt and Joseph was there, his brothers didn't recognize him? Why didn't they recognize him? He looked Egyptian. He spoke Egyptian, right? Why don't the Jews believe in Yeshua today? Because the church has been presenting an Egyptian Jesus, a Greek Jesus, someone who wants nothing to do with anything that's Jewish, who doesn't want any of the traditions. And even in most seminaries, they don't even teach Hebrew, they teach Greek. And you see pictures of Jesus holding a Greek calendar. And it looks like he has arthritis or something in his hands, if you've seen the pictures. Okay, that comes from Buddhism and Hinduism, which was like 500 to 1,000 years earlier. The Catholics incorporated all of that because they want to assimilate and win the lost. How are we going to win the lost? Let's make Jesus assimilate to the gods they know. And then that'll be the hook. It's like today when they try to teach the Muslims that Allah and God are the same. How many of you know God and Allah are not the same? Okay. When did replacement theology begin? When would you think replacement theology began? Anybody?
Before 2000.
It was around 200 years before Christ was even born. Okay? What happened? If you remember the Assyrian captivity in 700 BC, all the Jews were taken out of that land, and then all the people from another land were put in Israel to take their place. And then the lions and tigers and bears, oh my, were eating them. And so they said, we got to do something. We got to find out how to serve the God of this land. So they brought a bunch of the Jews back. They intermarried, and you get the Samaritans. And then what happens about the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, 168 BC, in the story of Hanukkah, the Samaritans were saying they were the true Jews. Just like we worship God on this mountain and them on that mountain, we're the true Jews. But as soon as Antiochus started persecuting them, they go, oh, we're not the true Jews, they are. Okay, so replacement theology began a lot earlier. Now, with that said, how many of you have heard of a historian and a geographer named Strabo? You may have heard it on the trip. The guides mentioned Strabo. Strabo lived during the time of the Messiah. He was even older than the Messiah, and he lived from about 63 BC all the way to 23 AD. All right? Listen to what he wrote. What city did Saul grow up in? Tarsus. But guess what? He was one of the most educated people around. He knew Latin because he's a Roman citizen. He knew Greek because that was the language of the day. He knew Hebrew because he's a rabbi. He knew Aramaic, which was a common language of the day. Strabo wrote that where Paul grew up in Tarsus, it had outdone both Athens and Alexandria in the study of philosophy. How many of you knew that Paul went to the University of the Greek philosophy in Tarsus? He studied the Greek philosophers. And so when he goes to Athens, where we're going, he's trying to use philosophy to win the pagans, those that knew philosophy. All right, so what does he do? He's brought to Athens. He's waiting for Silas and Timothy. And so he enters into debate in Acts 17, exactly where you're going to be tomorrow. And it says there were certain Epicurean and Stoic philosophers encountered him. Okay, does everyone know who the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers are, what the difference was? I will tell you real quick because of where we were just today. Listen to this. The Epicureans believed the best way to be happy was to never want anything. That's how you're happy. Because wanting things and not getting them leads to pain. The Epicureans had an important influence on Christianity. The Christian idea that holy people should separate themselves from the world and not think about their bodies or what they own, not think about their friends or families, and just focus on heaven owes itself to Epicureanism, and this is where the idea of living in a monastery began. And you see them living in the monastery, building them, separating themselves, not wanting to be involved in the politics of the world, not wanting to be involved in anything of the world. The best way to be happy is just to be by yourself, far away. Stoicism was also founded, both these were founded about 300 BC, both these philosophies. Okay, and the Stoics felt that pain and hardship should be endured without complaining. And for Stoics, the big question is, what is truth? John 18:38, Pilate said to Messiah, what is truth? That is telling you he was one of the Stoic philosophers. And they believed there is no universally grounded criterion of truth. You can have your truth and I can have my truth. Kind of like you're getting it. And the Stoics said the best way to be happy was just to be moderate in everything. Don't eat too much, don't party too much, but you shouldn't work or diet all the time either. So that was basically their thoughts. Okay, we're going to go back 300 years earlier than that, though. There was a man of Crete, which is this area. His name was Epimenides. I took philosophy in college, okay, and I studied the philosophers, and that was going to be one of my majors was philosophy. But listen to this. Epimenides was a semi-legendary 6th century BC. So we're talking 6th century BC. He was a Greek philosopher and a poet. And it is said that he fell asleep for 57 years in a Cretan cave sacred to Zeus, after which he woke up with the gift of prophecy. Now, Epimenides believed Zeus was immortal. Are you ready? Here's one of the things he wrote. They fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one, speaking about Zeus. The Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, and idle bellies. How many of you have heard that before? This is written in 600 BC by a Greek poet. Paul is quoting him. He plagiarized him and didn't even tell everybody that that's who he got it from. But listen to this. The lie of the Cretians was that Zeus was mortal. Epimenides felt he was immortal. So why would they fashion a tomb? In Titus 1:12, listen to what Paul says. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said the Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, and idle and slow belly. So here he does give them credit. There's another place he doesn't give credit. But here, if you don't read that it says even a prophet of their own, you don't realize this wasn't a verse necessarily inspired by God as much as he's quoting a prophet from 600 years BC. How many of you know there were no Christians in 600 BC? Okay. There were either Jews or pagans. There was nobody else. Okay. Now, in one of Epimenides' poems, there's a man that he wrote about that his name was Minos, and he addresses the gods this way. Okay? I'm going to give you the second half of that poem from 600 BC, where it says the Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. I'm about to give you the second half of that. But in Acts 17:22-27, Paul is standing in the midst of the Areopagus, and he's talking to the men of Athens, all right? And he comes across this altar that says to the unknown God. And he says, therefore, the one they worship without knowing was the one he proclaimed to them. He explains that God is the one who gives life and breath and all things to everyone, that we're all blood brothers. God has predetermined their times and boundaries, so they should seek the Lord and hope they might find him. Everyone familiar with that? Okay, here is the big kicker that you ought to be buckled in and even have your shoulder strap on. Listen to what Paul says. This is Paul. Now, I'm going to go back for just a second. In one of Epimenides' poems from 700 BC, he's talking about Zeus, and he said, they fashioned a tomb for you, O holy and high one. The Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. And then he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. Wait a minute. How many of us sing the song, in him we live and move and have our being? That was speaking about Zeus. That wasn't speaking about God. He's quoting a 700-year-old poem that was written to Zeus. And that is where he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. And then guess what? There was another man named Aratus from Cilicia of 300 BC, where Paul lives in Cilicia, Tarsus of Cilicia. And he had, his best known work was a poem called Astronomy. And listen to what he wrote. Let's begin with Zeus, whom we mortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbor is full of this deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring. That's the next line in Acts. In Acts, it says 17:28. Paul is stating to these Greek philosophers, in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own poets have said, for we are also his offspring. We never read the part that he's quoting their prophets. He wasn't saying this about God. He's even telling them, he's quoting their prophets who said this. How many of you know too many people try to win the Muslims by saying Allah and God are the same? Paul was trying to win the Greek philosophers by saying God and Zeus are the same. He was messing it up. Where's the very next place he goes is Corinth, where we're going next. And what did he write in Corinthians to them? I gave up on philosophy. I'm only preaching Christ and him crucified. Paul learned his lesson that trying to win the philosopher by quoting their philosophers from 600 and 300 BC isn't going to work. He learned better. And see, the problem is when the Gentiles took over the synagogues, they didn't know Torah. They have no moral base. Their only moral base is Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And so that's what they're bringing into the church. Paul learned from his mistake, but the early church fathers didn't. Matter of fact, here's another one. In 1 Corinthians 15:33, you may have heard this verse. Paul says, "Don't be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits." How many have read that? That came from a Greek philosopher in 300 BC. His name was Meander, who was the author of more than 100 comedies. And he wrote, "Evil communications corrupts good manners." It comes from the play Thigh. So many Christians don't know Paul is constantly quoting Greek philosophers. These weren't inspirations from the Holy Spirit. It's true that he said it, but Paul learned from his mistakes and he stopped doing that. And the church needs to learn also and quit trying to win the Greeks or the pagans through paganisms or whatever. So Paul gave up on the Greek mindset, but the brand new believing Gentiles with no Torah background still clung to Greek philosophy for their moral base because that's all they had. And for the last 2,000 years, when there was no Israel, the churches assumed they must be the ones to whom all those future promises referred to. But what happens? In 1948, all of a sudden, Israel appears on the scene, and now what are we to do? What's the church to do? So it was as if they decided there's not room for both of us. This doesn't fit our theology. The Christian Messiah can no longer be Jewish. His mother becomes a Catholic, his cousin John becomes a Baptist, and his neighbor become Nazarenes. That's a joke. Okay. To give you an idea of what the early church fathers said, Justin Martyr. Who's heard of Justin Martyr?
Yeah, bring it down. Here it comes.
Some have heard this message. 160 AD, in speaking to a Jew, he said, "The scriptures are no longer yours, they're now ours." I may have heard of Irenaeus, the bishop of Lyon. In 177 AD, declared Jews are disinherited from the grace of God. How many of you heard of Tertullian? 160 to 230 AD. He wrote a treatise called Against the Jews, and he announced that God had rejected the Jews in favor of the Christians. St. Jerome, 347 to 407, described the Jews as the serpents wearing the image of Judas. Their psalms and prayers are the braying of donkeys. In the 4th century, we have Chrysostom, the bishop of Antioch. And he was a great orator, and he wrote a series of 8 sermons against the Jews. To quote him, he said, "The synagogue is not only a brothel and a theater, it's also a den of robbers, a lodging for wild beasts. No Jew adores God. Jews are inveterate murderers, possessed by the devil. Their debauchery and drunkenness gives them the manners of the pig." Guess where Islam got the idea of calling the Jewish people having the manners of the pig? It was from the Christians. In the 5th century, the burning question was, well, if the Jews and Judaism were cursed by God, how come they're still around? So Augustine confronted this problem in his sermon against the Jews. He maintained that even though the Jews deserved the most severe punishment for having killed our Jesus, they have been kept alive by divine providence to serve together with their scriptures as witnesses to the truth of Christianity. Now, we're going to jump 1,000 years to Martin Luther. He wrote a book called Their Jews and Their Lies, and this is around the 1500s, when a lot of these things we saw were being built. And he says, what are we Christians to do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Since they live among us, we can't tolerate their conduct now that we're aware of their lying and reviling and blaspheming. Then Martin Luther says, I'm going to give you my sincere advice. He says, first, we need to set fire to their synagogues and schools and bury and cover with dirt whatever won't burn, so no man will ever again see a stone or cinder of them. And this is all going to be done in the honor of our Lord and Christendom, so that God might see that we are Christians. And we do not condone or knowingly tolerate such public lying, cursing, blaspheming of his Son and of his Christians. Whatever we tolerated in the past unknowingly, and I myself was unaware of it, it will be pardoned by God. Then he said, the second thing we need to do is burn all their houses down, raise them that they may be destroyed, because they pursue with them the same aims as in their synagogues. Instead, let them lodge under a roof or in a barn like the gypsies, and that'll bring home to them that they're not masters in our country. And third, I advise that all their prayer books and Talmudic writings in which such idolatry, lies, cursing, and blasphemy are taught be taken from them. Fourthly, I advise their rabbis be forbidden to teach on pain of loss of life and limb, for they have forfeited their right to such an office by holding the poor Jews captives with all of the sayings of Moses. Fifth, I advise that safe conduct on the highway be abolished completely for the Jews. They have no business in the countryside, since they are not lords, officials, or tradesmen, or the like, so let them stay at home. I guess if you got, you already burnt their homes down. Okay. Sixth, I advise that usury be prohibited to them, and that all of their cash and treasure of silver and gold be taken from them and put aside for safekeeping. Seventh, the last one. He says, I also think we should burn down their synagogues, forbid all that I enumerated earlier, force them to work, deal harshly with them as Moses did in the wilderness, slaying 3,000, lest the whole people perish. It would be wrong to be merciful and confirm them in their conduct. I have now done my duty. Now let everyone see to his. I am exonerated. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever heard that before. But the problem is the people that don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And the one thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. The church does not replace Israel. The church does not become Israel. But non-Jews who turn to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob join the people of faith that are mentioned in Hebrews 11. How many have heard of Hebrews 11? There's not one Christian mentioned. They're all Jews. Go back and look. That's who we're grafted into. And when you read that, you see a lot of it's talking about Hanukkah. But I want you to understand, when you go and set foot on the Areopagus in Athens tomorrow, and Paul is debating with the philosophers, realize he was using the wrong philosophy to win the philosophers, and then he changed his mind and says to the very next stop we're going to, Corinth, forget philosophy. I'm only preaching Christ and him crucified. And so may that help all of us have a better understanding of where we're going the next 2 days and all the paganism that we're encountering. The church needs to wake up. I have a good friend that was a Muslim for 50 years. He even memorized the Quran. And then he got saved by a near-death experience. The Lord literally appeared to him in the hospital room. He was about to die, and he thought the Lord was Allah. And the Lord says, guess what? I'm not Allah, you know. And he got radically saved for like the last 5 years. And I asked him if he felt the church was asleep today. And this former Muslim said, no, the church is not asleep. It's in a coma. And so I really believe that Jim and Rosemary and us here at El Shaddai, our job is, I really felt like my job was not to save the lost, it's to save the church. And to bring them back in alignment to an understanding and have them put on the Hebrew perspective of what's going on so they have a more accurate understanding. Yes?
Will you post this for us, these notes for us?
Sure, and Jill just recorded all of this, and we'll put it up on our website for free and all that, and I can give you the notes. Yes?
Would you, now that you've read Martin Luther so connect him to Hitler?
Well, okay, this will go real quick. Martin Luther, hello, Germany, where all the Lutherans live, began with. Okay, think about this. The early church in the first century after Jesus said the Jews cannot live among us as Jews. In other words, they had to convert. The Jews cannot live among us as Jews. So what happened several hundred years later? The governments of the nations took what the early church fathers said and just cut off 2 words. The Jews cannot live among us. So they started kicking them out of every nation. And then Hitler says, I want to follow in the footsteps of Luther, and we're going to take that saying and knock off the next 2 words and just say the Jews cannot live. That's where Hitler got this from, is from replacement theology. And if we're ever going to get to the point where we're going to be interceding, this reminds me of a whole nother tangent. I can't go on because I know y'all want to go to bed. But the armor of God is totally misunderstood. It is not a Roman soldier costume. The Jews hated the Romans. Isaiah talked about the helmet of salvation before Rome even existed. Okay? The armor of God was the high priest's garments. The breastplate was the high priest's breastplate, not a little breastplate piece of armor. Exactly. But anyway, I don't have time to go all that. But all of our teachings are free at esm.us for El Shaddai Ministries. Everything's free, all the teachings, all the notes. We've got years, which remind me, I did bring with me, just to give away, if anybody wants them, a white USB key and a blue USB key, because if anything happens and the internet goes completely down, I have on one USB key 80 hours of video teaching, 2,000 pages of notes, even kids' curriculum, teaching them how to read and write Hebrew, and I'll give them away for free. I have 2 different years of teaching, one for 2019, 2020, and one for 2021. But on that one key is everything you would need to lead a Bible study if anything goes haywire and you don't need the internet. Thank you very much.